July 14th, 1948. Blackwood Creek, Kentucky. The summer sun, a malevolent eye in the vast, cloudless sky, beat down with a relentless, suffocating intensity, baking the unpaved roads and raising dust devils in its wake. A heavy, humid air hung thick and stagnant, a palpable weight that pressed against the skin, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil mixed with something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tang of decay that seemed to cling to the very landscape, seeped into the ancient trees. The only consistent sound was the relentless, high-pitched thrum of cicadas, a monotonous drone that felt less like nature's symphony and more like a primal, unsettling warning. Then, piercing through the insect chorus, came a distant, unsettling wail, the unmistakable, raw cry of a child, prolonged and desperate, echoing from somewhere deep within the dense, unforgiving hills. Sheriff Robert Bob Brody's Ford sedan, its paint faded by years of sun and body, rattled by countless miles on rough terrain, lumbered along the winding dirt track, kicking up a plume of fine ochre dust that momentarily obscured the dense, green foliage. He adjusted his sweat-soaked Stetson, the brim already damp, his mind replaying the vague, unsettling call from Agnes Miller, the new school teacher recently arrived from Lexington. She'd spoken with a nervous urgency about the peculiar health of the two young Blackwell girls, children from an isolated homestead tucked away so deep in these hills, even Bob, a local for nearly 50 years, rarely saw them. He'd heard whispers over the decades, seen the way the Blackwells kept to themselves, but a teacher's genuine concern wasn't something he could simply dismiss, not when it involved children. As his vehicle finally creaked to a halt before the dilapidated, unpainted Blackwell house, a structure that looked like it was slowly surrendering to the relentless grip of nature, the cicadas' buzz seemed to intensify, a deafening hum that felt like the very pulse of the suffocating heat. The distant wail had ceased, replaced by an eerie, profound silence that swallowed even the sound of his own breathing, making the air feel impossibly heavy. A faint, cloying odor, distinct from the damp earth, now permeated the air, something metallic and sickly sweet, a smell that instinctively put him on edge. Bob stepped out, his boots crunching on loose gravel, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of the revolver holstered at his hip. What unspeakable truth lay hidden behind the weathered planks of this forgotten home, a truth so deeply woven into the very fabric of this land and its isolated inhabitants that it would forever stain the quiet, unforgiving hills of Blackwood Creek. The dilapidated, unpainted Blackwell house seemed to sag under the weight of the oppressive heat, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from a forgotten past. Sheriff Robert Bob Brody stepped from his Ford, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the only sound breaking the cicadas' relentless drone. Elias Blackwell, a formidable figure etched by hard labor and an unyielding will, emerged from the shadows of the porch. His face, a landscape of deep-set lines, offered no genuine welcome, only a challenge in his cold, direct gaze. "Sheriff Brody." Elias's voice was a low rumble devoid of warmth. "To what do we owe this unexpected visit?" Bob adjusted his sweat-soaked Stetson, feeling the tension immediately. He stated his purpose, mentioning Agnes Miller's call about the girls' peculiar health, trying to keep his tone neutral, professional, but the air was already thick with unspoken animosity. The faint, metallic odor from earlier now seemed stronger, more unsettling, clinging to the weathered wood of the house itself, a silent prelude to the horrors within. Elias's lips thinned, a shadow of irritation crossing his stern features. "My girls are fine, Sheriff. Ain't no business of a school teacher or the law what goes on in my home." Just then, two figures emerged from the gloom of the doorway, Eleanor and Clara Blackwell. Their gaunt faces, pale beneath tangled, lank hair, were almost identical in their haunted expression. Eleanor, the elder, held a small child, its head disproportionately large, eyes distant. Clara, frail and visibly younger, clutched another, equally listless infant. Their movements were slow, almost hesitant, their eyes darting between Elias and Bob, betraying a deep-seated fear. The peculiar health Agnes had described was immediately evident. Stunted growth, unusual facial features, a profound lethargy that went beyond mere shyness. Bob's gut clenched. This wasn't just hillfolk oddities. This was something far more disturbing. Brody knew the dance of these isolated communities, the fierce protectiveness of privacy that often bordered on paranoia. He had no immediate warrant, only Agnes's vague concerns and his own mounting dread. "Mr. Blackwell, I just need to speak with the girls, ensure everything's all right. It's standard procedure when there's a report concerning children's welfare." Elias's posture stiffened, his gaze hardening. "My family keeps to itself, Sheriff. We always have. There's no law against that." The unspoken threat hung heavy in the humid air. A local man asserting dominion, challenging state law in his self-proclaimed sovereign territory. Brody felt the familiar jurisdictional tightrope. Pushing too hard without concrete evidence risked alienating the community and hindering future intervention. Yet to do nothing felt like a betrayal of his badge and of the children's silent pleas. Leaving the Blackwell homestead, the Ford's tires crunched away the silence. But the images of Eleanor, Clara, and their listless children were seared into Bob Brody's mind. Elias Blackwell's defiance, his assertion of family law over state statute, resonated with the deep-seated distrust of outsiders common in these parts. But the children's vacant eyes and the sisters' palpable fear screamed a different truth. Brody knew he couldn't act on a hunch. Not yet, but he had enough. Agnes Miller's initial report combined with his unsettling observations. The unsanitary conditions, the children's apparent neglect and deformities, provided the preliminary justification. He would return to the county seat, consult with Judge Thompson, and secure a warrant. This wasn't just about a welfare check anymore. It was about tearing open a hidden wound in Blackwood Creek. A wound that festered beneath layers of isolation and twisted tradition. The quiet hills would soon echo with more than just cicadas. Back in the county seat, the oppressive Kentucky humidity still clinging to his uniform, Sheriff Brody wasted no time. The disturbing images from the Blackwell homestead, the gaunt, listless children, Elias's chillingly defiant gaze, and the pervasive, sickly sweet odor fueled an urgent determination he hadn't felt in years. He presented his detailed observations to Judge Thompson, a man whose weathered countenance mirrored the rugged landscape of Blackwood Creek, but whose legal acumen remained sharp. Brody meticulously recounted Agnes Miller's initial, deeply concerned report, his own unsettling visit, the clearly unsanitary living conditions, visible signs of severe neglect, and the children's alarming physical deformities. This was unequivocally more than mere hillfolk oddities. It was a compelling case for immediate legal intervention. Thompson, understanding the profound gravity, granted a comprehensive search and seizure warrant, authorizing the immediate removal of the Blackwell children for urgent medical evaluation and protection. The deliberate machinery of justice had begun its slow, inexorable grind, preparing to forcefully expose a truth long buried. Sheriff Brody, now accompanied by 2 uniformed state troopers from Frankfort, returned to the isolated Blackwell homestead under the relentless afternoon sun. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the cicadas, drone an unnerving backdrop. Elias Blackwell, alerted by the approaching vehicles, emerged from the shadowed porch, his face a mask of furious defiance, a shotgun clutched loosely. Brody, his voice firm, explained the warrant, but Elias met him with a guttural roar, threatening violence against any outsider trespassing. The confrontation was brief but volatile. The state troopers, trained for rural standoffs, moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Elias and securing him. Inside the dilapidated house, the scene was even more harrowing. Eleanor and Clara, huddled, offered no resistance, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and perhaps a flicker of relief. The 4 children were carefully removed from the squalor, their small, frail bodies fragile in the officers' arms, their vacant stares fixed on a world they barely understood. At the county hospital in Lexington, a team of doctors and nurses, initially prepared for typical rural ailments, were quickly overwhelmed by the grim reality of the Blackwell children. Their initial assessment revealed profound malnutrition, severe developmental delays, and a distressing array of physical anomalies. Skeletal deformities, unusual facial features, and neurological deficits. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a pediatrician recently arrived from Louisville, immediately suspected a genetic component, meticulously documenting every symptom. The Kentucky Department of Public Welfare was swiftly notified, their caseworkers stepping in to observe Eleanor and Clara. The sisters, present during the examinations, moved with a haunting, almost robotic compliance, their responses minimal, their eyes rarely meeting anyone's gaze. Their psychological conditioning was palpable, a deep-seated fear and an inability to articulate their experiences, suggesting years of profound isolation and subjugation. The medical team's findings painted a horrifying picture of generations of extreme consanguinity, a tragic legacy now manifest in the children's suffering bodies. With the children safely hospitalized, the investigation broadened significantly. Kentucky State Police forensics experts, though limited by 1948 technologies, meticulously processed the Blackwell homestead. They collected samples, photographed the squalid conditions, and documented the pervasive lack of sanitation, searching for any physical evidence that could corroborate the unfolding narrative. Detectives began the arduous task of interviewing Elias Blackwell, who remained stubbornly uncooperative, clinging to his warped interpretation of family sanctity. Concurrently, a team delved into public records, county birth and death certificates, property deeds, and local census data stretching back decades. The findings were stark: an almost complete absence of external marriages, a disturbing pattern of names repeating through generations, and records of property that had never changed hands outside the family. While national databases as we know them today didn't exist, state archives and local registries confirmed the Blackwells' extreme, almost hermetically sealed, isolation, creating a chilling paper trail of their self-imposed genetic confinement. During a supervised medical visit, a pivotal moment unfolded. Clara Blackwell, displaying a fragile, newfound courage, discreetly slipped a folded, handwritten note to Agnes Miller, the schoolteacher whose initial concern had sparked this entire investigation. The message, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a desperate plea, detailing the forced marriages by blood and the terrifying, tyrannical control Elias had exerted over their lives for decades. It spoke of fear, of unspoken suffering, and a desperate yearning for freedom. This tangible piece of evidence provided the first direct, undeniable confirmation of the unspeakable practices within the Blackwell home. Meanwhile, a sympathetic social worker observed Eleanor, the elder sister. Eleanor remained deeply withdrawn, her eyes hollow, her responses often monosyllabic. Her profound psychological conditioning was evident. She seemed incapable of fully comprehending or articulating her trauma, trapped in a catatonic state of learned helplessness. The contrast between Clara's fragile defiance and Eleanor's resigned silence painted a heartbreaking picture of their shared, yet individually endured, torment. Elias Blackwell, now confined to a county jail cell, was far from powerless. Word of his arrest and the removal of the children spread like wildfire through the deep hollows and isolated homesteads surrounding Blackwood Creek, twisting into a narrative of government overreach and an assault on sacred family traditions. Soon, Sheriff Brody felt the subtle but undeniable shift. Trucks with familiar Blackwood Creek plates began appearing near the courthouse, parked for hours, their occupants watching. Calls to the station, once routine, now included veiled threats and demands for Elias's immediate release. This wasn't an organized protest, but a silent, pervasive resistance, a collective assertion of the mountain people's unwritten code, making it clear that Blackwood Creek would not easily surrender its secrets or its patriarch to the outside world. The community itself became a battleground of whispered allegiances. While Agnes Miller and a few brave souls openly supported Sheriff Brody's intervention, a significant portion of the local populace sided with Elias, viewing the legal action as an unwarranted intrusion into private family matters. For generations, the Blackwells had been peculiar, but they were their peculiar. This deep-seated distrust of outsiders, a hallmark of these remote Appalachian communities, now manifested as cold shoulders, information drying up, and an impalpable sense of hostility directed at Brody and anyone associated with the investigation. The social fabric of Blackwood Creek, already threadbare, began to fray under the immense pressure, creating a formidable barrier to any further investigation or the eventual resettlement of the sisters. The initial legal proceedings immediately hit a snag, highlighting the immense challenges faced by local authorities in navigating such an unprecedented case. Elias Blackwell's court-appointed attorney, a seasoned local known for his tenacity, swiftly filed a motion to dismiss the charges, arguing a violation of Elias's constitutional rights and an overreach of state jurisdiction into what he termed private family customs. He painted a picture of a loving, if unconventional family targeted by an overly zealous schoolteacher and a sheriff biased against their traditional way of life. The defense team strategically invoked arguments of religious freedom and the sanctity of the home, effectively muddying the waters and presenting the case as a cultural clash rather than a clear-cut instance of abuse, threatening to delay justice indefinitely. The state police forensics team, despite the technological limitations of 1948, meticulously cataloged the interior of the Blackwell homestead. Beyond the visible squalor, a persistent cloying odor, initially dismissed as mere decay, was chemically analyzed. Investigators pinpointed it as a complex mix, indicative of long-term, unmanaged organic waste and a pervasive lack of hygiene that fostered bacterial growth. They discovered crude, makeshift sanitary arrangements and evidence of shared, unsanitary bedding, suggesting a family confined to a few rooms. This detailed documentation provided irrefutable proof of the severe neglect the children and sisters endured, laying a foundation of physical evidence that supported the medical team's early assessments of their compromised health. The house itself became a silent, damning witness to years of hidden suffering, a stark contrast to Elias's claims of privacy. Back at the Lexington Hospital, Dr. Evelyn Reed and her team intensified their examinations of the Blackwell children. The initial observations of stunted growth and unusual facial features now coalesced with more specific diagnoses: multiple cases of cleft palates, clubfoot, and a rare metabolic disorder affecting cognitive development, all conditions known to be significantly more prevalent in offspring of consanguineous unions. Blood samples, though limited in what they could reveal genetically in 1948, were meticulously stored and analyzed for any anomalies. This medical data provided the scientific backbone for the prosecution, transforming Agnes Miller's vague concerns into a precise, devastating indictment of the family's practices. The children's suffering bodies became living proof of a genetic legacy twisted by generations of isolation and a perverted quest for purity, horrifying the medical staff. The paper trail, meticulously compiled by the investigative team, became increasingly damning. Researchers delved into county archives, unearthing property deeds that showed the Blackwell land hadn't changed hands for well over a century, reinforcing their extreme isolation. Local census records, stretching back to the late 1800s, revealed a disturbing pattern: an almost complete absence of new surnames entering the family tree. The same few names, Blackwell, Miller, a distant, unrelated branch, and a couple of others, repeated across generations, often listed with ambiguous relationships or missing marital details. This genealogical work, cross-referenced with local birth and death certificates, painted a chilling statistical picture of profound inbreeding. It wasn't just a suspicion, it was a documented fact, a tragic testament to a family intentionally severing itself from the broader human gene pool for generations. Clara's whispered note, a tangible piece of desperate truth, galvanized the investigators. While Eleanor remained largely catatonic, her silence spoke volumes. confirming the depth of the psychological trauma. Detectives, armed with Clara's revelation about forced marriages by blood, revisited Elias Blackwell. His interviews, previously an exercise in stonewalling, now faced pointed questions about specific family members and relationships documented in the newly uncovered records. Though he continued to deny the accusations, his bluster became less convincing, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack under the weight of accumulating evidence. The investigation broadened to include interviews with elderly residents who, initially hesitant, now cautiously shared fragmented whispers of peculiar Blackwell traditions, tales long dismissed as mere folklore, but now gaining chilling credibility. The convergence of medical pathology, forensic documentation of the homestead's conditions, and the historical genealogical research created an undeniable, horrifying narrative. Dr. Reed's medical reports provided the scientific proof of the children's genetic afflictions. The state police's evidence from the home detailed the squalor and neglect, and the county records laid bare the generations of consanguinity. Clara's note, a direct plea from within the family, acted as the emotional cornerstone, giving voice to the voiceless victims. This multifaceted approach, piecing together fragments from science, history, and personal testimony, transformed a vague concern into an ironclad case. The peculiar health of the Blackwell children was no longer a mystery. It was the tragic manifestation of a self-imposed, generations-old curse, meticulously enforced by Elias Blackwell, and now undeniably exposed to the harsh light of justice. Eleanor Blackwell, still a ghost in her own skin, observed her children from behind a pane of glass in the hospital's pediatric ward. Their small, fragile bodies, now receiving nourishment and care, seemed to slowly reawaken, though the genetic scars remained etched upon them. A sympathetic social worker, Martha Jenkins, a woman with a kind but persistent gaze, had spent hours simply sitting with Eleanor, offering tea and quiet presence. Martha understood that Eleanor's silence was not defiance, but a profound, almost catatonic response to years of unimaginable trauma. The sight of her children, no longer just existing but now being cared for, alongside Clara's fragile but determined spirit, began to chip away at the walls Eleanor had built around herself, a defense mechanism against a world too horrific to confront. One humid afternoon, as rain lashed against the hospital windows, Eleanor finally broke. Her confession wasn't a coherent narrative, but a torrent of fragmented memories, choked sobs, and raw, visceral fear. Martha listened patiently, her heart aching as Eleanor, in halting whispers, confirmed Clara's note. She spoke of Elias's absolute dominion, the chilling rituals, the generations of blood purity, enforced through forced unions, and the constant, suffocating terror that had been their daily bread. Each broken sentence was a nail hammered into Elias's coffin, a devastating indictment of his monstrous reign. This was the raw, unvarnished truth, straight from the heart of the suffering, a crucial piece of internal testimony that few had ever dared to imagine, let alone speak aloud. Eleanor's confession, though delivered in a whisper, echoed with seismic force through the ongoing investigation. It was more than mere corroboration. It was an emotional earthquake. For the prosecution, it solidified the case against Elias Blackwell, transforming vague suspicions and medical data into a deeply personal, undeniably horrific account of systemic abuse. It also provided invaluable insight into the psychological conditioning that had rendered both sisters so compliant for so long, explaining Eleanor's previous silence not as complicity, but as a testament to the depth of her trauma. Despite the continued resistance from parts of the Blackwood Creek community, Eleanor's brave, if broken, testimony now stood as an undeniable second pillar of truth, alongside Clara's note, making the path to justice for the Blackwell children clearer and more urgent than ever. The local news, though primitive compared to today's instant broadcasts, caught wind of the Blackwell case, immediately sensationalizing the hillfolk horror and the mystery of the cursed family. Small-town papers from Lexington and even Louisville picked up the story, their headlines often tinged with a blend of shock and morbid fascination. This external scrutiny, however, only solidified the resolve of Elias's most fervent supporters within Blackwood Creek. Trucks with familiar Blackwood Creek plates, now displaying crude, hand-painted signs condemning government meddling and demanding Elias's release, became a common sight around the county courthouse. Whispers of a Blackwell Defense Fund circulated, fueled by a deep-seated distrust of outsiders and a warped sense of loyalty to their own, no matter how depraved. Sheriff Brody found himself facing not just a criminal, but a community on the brink, with the lines between right and wrong blurred by generations of isolation and fear, the air thick with tension. The media's spotlight, however sensationalized, only intensified the legal battle. Elias Blackwell's defense team, now visibly bolstered by financial support from his loyalists, escalated their tactics dramatically. They filed multiple motions not just to dismiss the charges, but to fundamentally challenge the very legality of the initial warrant, arguing vehemently that the children's forced removal was an unconstitutional abduction based on flimsy evidence and overt cultural prejudice. The defense meticulously painted Agnes Miller as an overzealous, naive outsider and Sheriff Brody as a heavy-handed tool of state interference, deliberately misinterpreting local customs and traditions. This strategy aimed to portray Elias as a victim of a modern-day witch hunt, a mountain man whose traditional way of life was being unjustly attacked by an urbanized, morally superior establishment, threatening to derail justice and potentially return the children to their nightmare. The escalating tension wasn't confined solely to the legal arena. It spilled directly into the daily lives of those involved in the investigation. Threats, once subtle and veiled, became increasingly direct and unsettling. Sheriff Brody's patrol car tires were found slashed one night, a clear and menacing message left on his doorstep. Agnes Miller, walking home from the schoolhouse a few days later, found her path deliberately blocked by a small group of grim-faced men, their silence more menacing than any spoken words. She was issued a stark, chilling warning to, quote, mind her own business. These incidents weren't isolated acts of random vandalism or harassment. They were calculated acts of intimidation, a clear demonstration that Elias Blackwell, even from behind the bars of a county jail cell, retained a terrifying degree of influence and control over a segment of the community. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was a psychological war, a desperate attempt by Elias's loyalists to reclaim what they saw as their own, and to silence anyone who dared to challenge their deeply entrenched, twisted traditions. The pressure mounted inexorably on Brody and his dedicated team, pushing them to their absolute limits. Recognizing the growing volatility and the potential for widespread unrest, the Kentucky State Police significantly increased their presence in Blackwood Creek. Patrols became noticeably more frequent, and plainclothes officers were discreetly deployed to monitor the rapidly deteriorating situation. This visible law enforcement presence, however, was met with a potent mixture of deep resentment and outright defiance by Elias's most ardent supporters, leading to several minor but tense confrontations that, by sheer luck, barely avoided escalating into full-blown violence. The community, once quietly divided by whispers and unspoken judgments, now openly fractured, its social fabric tearing apart. Families argued bitterly, long-standing friendships dissolved, and a deep, acrimonious chasm opened between those who vehemently demanded justice for the suffering Blackwell children and those who stubbornly clung to the old ways, fiercely defending Elias's twisted rights. This dramatic escalation transformed Blackwood Creek from a quiet, isolated hollow into a simmering crucible of conflict, a stark battlefield where ancient, perverted traditions clashed violently with the slow, inexorable march of modern justice, demanding that its hidden horrors finally be brought into the harsh, unforgiving light. The air in the county courthouse hung heavy, thick with anticipation, and the stifling Kentucky heat, as Clara Blackwell, frail and visibly trembling, was led to the witness stand. Her voice, a barely audible whisper at first, grew with a fragile, newfound courage as she recounted the unspeakable. She spoke of Elias's absolute command, the chilling, marriages by blood that had been their inescapable fate, and the constant, suffocating fear that had permeated every moment of their existence within the isolated homestead. The jury, a cross-section of local farmers and townspeople, watched her with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension, their faces reflecting the profound shock of a truth they had perhaps always suspected but never dared to articulate. Each halting word, each tear that traced a path down Clara's gaunt cheek, hammered another nail into the carefully constructed facade of Elias Blackwell's twisted dominion, transforming abstract accusations into a raw, undeniable human tragedy unfolding before their very eyes. In the gallery, Eleanor Blackwell remained a haunting, silent presence, her hollow eyes distant, seemingly incapable of registering the seismic confession of her younger sister. Her profound psychological conditioning, a defense mechanism against years of unimaginable trauma, rendered her almost catatonic, a stark testament to the depth of her suffering and the insidious nature of Elias's control. Following Clara's harrowing testimony, Dr. Evelyn Reed took the stand, her clinical precision a stark contrast to the emotional rawness. She presented the irrefutable medical evidence, detailed reports on the children's severe skeletal deformities, cleft palates, clubfoot, and rare metabolic disorders. With charts and diagrams, Dr. Reed meticulously connected these afflictions directly to the documented generations of extreme consanguinity within the Blackwell lineage, transforming a family secret into a devastating scientific indictment. The jury's deliberation felt endless, a palpable tension gripping the entire courtroom as Blackwood Creek held its breath. When they finally returned, their faces grim and resolute, a hushed silence fell. Elias Blackwell, his eyes fixed and defiant to the last, stood as the judge's solemn voice pierced the stillness, asking for the verdict. The foreman's voice, clear and chillingly firm, pronounced the word that would forever echo through the hills: guilty. Guilty on multiple counts of incest and statutory rape. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, quickly followed by a heavy, profound silence. Justice, hard-won and painstakingly unearthed, had finally begun its slow, inexorable grind, exposing the darkest, most deeply buried secret of Blackwood Creek to the harsh, unforgiving light. Elias Blackwell received a life sentence, an unusually severe judgment for the era, a clear message echoing through the hollows of Kentucky that such monstrous acts would not be tolerated, regardless of tradition or isolation. Eleanor and Clara, the two sisters whose lives had been a living hell, were carefully transferred to a state-run rehabilitation facility far from Blackwood Creek. Their journey to adapt to a world they barely knew had just begun, a long, arduous path of therapy and education, slowly chipping away at years of profound psychological conditioning and trauma. The Blackwell children, bearing the undeniable physical and developmental scars of their lineage, were placed into specialized foster care, their futures uncertain, but now, finally, offered a chance at a life untainted by the curse that had defined their birth. This initial step towards healing marked the end of a nightmare, but the beginning of an equally challenging recovery for all involved. The small community of Blackwood Creek was left to grapple with an unbearable legacy, a profound shame and horror that had festered in its midst for generations. This landmark case sparked an uncomfortable yet vital conversation across Kentucky and beyond, forcing a broader societal reflection on hidden communities, the dangers of extreme isolation, and the critical need for robust social welfare outreach programs. The long-term impact on the survivors was immeasurable. Eleanor and Clara faced a lifetime of psychological recovery, while their children navigated a world burdened by their genetic heritage. This saga underscored the inherent responsibilities of society to protect its most vulnerable members, forcing a re-evaluation of how state law could effectively penetrate and dismantle twisted, self-proclaimed traditions that defied human decency. It was a wake-up call, reverberating through the legal and social fabric of the nation. The chilling account of the Blackwell sisters serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of extreme isolation, generational trauma, and unchecked power within a family unit. It urges us to reflect on the evolution of child welfare laws and social services in the United States, and the ongoing challenges of identifying and intervening in hidden cases of abuse, reminding us that vigilance and empathy are paramount. This story, a tragic thread in the broader tapestry of American social history, ensures that no child is ever truly forgotten in the shadows of our society. If this profound story moved you, if it sparked a desire to understand the hidden corners of our society, then hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more deep dives into America's past. And for another compelling case of justice unearthed from the shadows, watch our next video, exploring the challenges faced by early child protection agencies.